right, everybody, welcome to week, I'm going to say 5. We are officially in the back half of the 2021 legislative session. We are across the halfway mark. The filing deadline for new legislation has passed. And we are getting into prime time. This is where you really start to see things live or die. Bills are going to move or not beginning really this week. So we got a couple things coming right up. Sammy, what do we have coming up tomorrow?
We have our big bill, Community Solar, Senate Bill 84, coming up tomorrow in Senate Tax, Business, and Transportation in the afternoon.
We also have tomorrow morning Senate Bill 312. This is kind of the wildlife changes omnibus bill. If you have representation, if you have senators who sit on either the Tax, Business, and Transportation Committee or Senate Conservation, where Senate Bill 312 is going to be tomorrow morning, please give them a ring and let them know that you would like them to support Senate Bill 312 in conservation or Senate Bill 84 in tax, business, and transportation. You've got some good opportunities to support bills. It's also, we had an interesting week last week. Sammy, what's going on in the world?
I'm pretty sure everyone knows what's going on in Texas and everyone's loss of power. It's been a complicated time for our friends out in Texas. So thought we might want to talk about it a little bit today. So for those who don't know, in the 1930s, President FDR, he had a package that connected all the power in the country, which created 2 grids, Eastern and Western power grids. But Texas decided to not join in either grid, and they created their own, which is managed by ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which is ironic. But in the 1930s, Texas deregulated this power grid because the belief that the free market would provide enough regulation and there wasn't really a need for any government oversight. So jump forward 30 years today, where we're facing all the consequences of climate change with extreme weather conditions on both ends of the spectrum. We had the hurricanes, but now Texas is facing what we all know, record-breaking low temperatures, and the Texas power grid is not prepared for these extreme winter conditions. What they're really only prepared for is summer conditions. So people turning up their AC and making sure that their homes are cool enough, but what they weren't prepared for was anything cold related. A lot of trees freezing over and then falling into power lines, the pipelines and the actual power facilities themselves freezing over and not being able to process raw product into the resources we need to provide our energy. So privately owned power plants, not expecting these cold temperatures, never really invested in winterizing their equipment. And power plants and pipelines now are just not able to power the rest of the entirety of Texas. And now we're left with the current conditions that Texans are facing right now.
A perfect storm of problems. I mean, we're kind of seeing demand spike, resources fall apart because natural gas is freezing in the lines and other things, and then transmission breakdown. So it's kind of getting hit in all 3 phases in Texas. And then you combine that with the fact they've got this self-contained grid that can't really access resources outside of the state in a very significant way in order to sort of provide extra load. And it's just, it's a tough one. You can kind of see how it happened. So this connects, one of the questions we've gotten in the last couple of days is like, well, what are we doing to prevent this kind of a situation in New Mexico? And it's important to kind of understand that we're in a little bit of a different situation. As Sammy mentioned, there are, those 3 sort of big grids in the US, the Eastern, Western, and Texas. We're in the Western. So we're to a certain extent, we are already a little bit in a better position because we have the ability through the grid to access markets outside of the state of New Mexico. So generation that is kind of further afield, and kind of purchase things on the day ahead market that can help insulate us if we think that we're going to have a gigantic spike in demand or a collapse of the resources. Other things that we have done that you can look at, in 2019, we passed a grid modernization bill, and the state government has been basically holding meetings and work groups around grid modernization for a little while. And we should start to see that turn into some policy changes, some changes to the grid that make the grid just more resilient, specifically against things like these. The old model of generating power way over here and getting it over to houses way over and somewhere completely different part of region of the country, and having that power be tied to something like coal or nuclear that doesn't scale up and down really efficiently. That's kind of the model that's failed in Texas here, and that's what we're moving away from. As you see distributed generation take a bigger role, people are generating more power on their rooftops. Community solar bill is moving this year, as you mentioned earlier, so that can have a role to play in kind of hardening our grid against this kind of against these kind of events. So there are things we can do. The other thing to keep an eye on is that the Public Service Company of New Mexico, PNM, our largest utility, has talked openly, and I'm not sure if they are moving forward with or if they have already, maybe a topic of research for next week's video, to joining what something's called the Energy Imbalance Market West-wide. And this is really a regional sort of, not exactly like a regional transmission organization, but it's basically plugging New Mexico much more substantively into the larger grid around us, which again is going to help us balance our loads a lot more effectively. It provides better access to markets outside of New Mexico for renewable power we do generate here and export. And it also creates a little bit more resiliency if we do have stuff like this happen in New Mexico, where we are seeing big spikes in demand that are going to be difficult for us to meet with the resource loads that we have, or the resource mixes that we have. So there are steps that we're taking in New Mexico to make sure this doesn't really happen here. There's some things that are already in place to help insulate us from this kind of outcome that they saw in Texas. But at the end of the day, I think really what's the biggest takeaway for me from this Texas situation is that you cannot wait to upgrade your grid. We've got most of the country, I mean, certainly Texas, but even parts of the Western grid and Eastern grids are based on using technologies and based on practices that have been around for 60 to 70 years. I mean, you think about glass bulbs on, distribution lines. It's just, this stuff needs to get updated because we generate and consume power so much differently today than we do when this grid was designed. So the way that, the need that's been meeting for the last several decades it's just changing drastically. So being proactive is the best thing we can do to make sure this doesn't happen, continue to happen in other places. Also, don't deregulate your power market, but that's a topic for a different video going forward. I think that's our update for this week. Thanks for tuning in. We're gonna have a great week. We got a month to go, and we got a lot of good bills that have the opportunity to get across the finish line. So stay tuned. Follow us on social media at ProtectNM on Twitter, Conservation Voters NM on Facebook, and we will talk to you next week.